Hey guys, tonight we wander into the warm dark between a temple wall and a stack of clay tablets, where lamplight flickers over cuneiform signs, and the oldest stories in the world seem to whisper that even the gods may have needed dinner and a decent nap. You move through ancient Sumer, with dust on your sandals and barley in the air, listening to tales that might sound grand and cosmic at first, but soon begin to feel oddly domestic, as if heaven itself once had a kitchen schedule. Some parts of this story are widely accepted history, some parts are interpretation, and some parts are calm, what-if imagination. We will keep the solid ground separate from the mist. Historians debate many of these details, and if the evidence is thin, we'll say so. Still, you probably would not survive this place very gracefully, mostly because the heat is relentless, the beer is thick enough to confuse a spoon, and nobody here is handing you a mattress. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're settling in, post your location and local time down below. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You step closer to the tablets first, because that is where the safest ground usually is. Most historians agree that ancient Mesopotamia, especially Sumer and the later Akkadian tradition built around it, left behind some of the earliest written myths humanity has ever found. These myths were copied and recopied over centuries, sometimes in Sumerian, sometimes in Akkadian, sometimes with small changes, like stories told around a fire and then frozen into clay before they could drift too far. Archaeology suggests that these texts were not tidy theology manuals in the modern sense. They were hymns, myths, royal inscriptions, ritual compositions, laments, and literary experiments, all pressed into the same broad world of temple life and scribal learning. That matters, because when you read ancient stories expecting a clean statement like, "Here is exactly what the gods are, no questions asked," Mesopotamia gives you a polite shrug and hands you a basket of fragments. The evidence we do have points to a religious world that is rich, practical, poetic, and sometimes wonderfully inconsistent. Gods command storms, shape destinies, and shine with terrifying authority, yet they also feast, sleep, speak in councils, grow angry, change their minds, and in some stories seem almost alarmingly close to human routines. That is not proof of anything exotic by itself. Let me rephrase that more carefully. It is not proof of hidden biological gods walking around with lunch breaks. It is, however, a puzzle worth following. The name Anunnaki enters this world with an aura that can feel heavier than the evidence sometimes allows. In popular culture, the word has been stretched, polished, launched into outer space, and made to carry more baggage than a tired donkey on market day. A popular rumor claims that the Anunnaki were literally alien overlords stranded on Earth, forced to mine, scheme, and snack like overworked supervisors from another planet. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it lingers because the original word already sounds mysterious enough to make the modern imagination put on dramatic music. What's broadly accepted is more grounded. In Mesopotamian tradition, the Anunnaki appear as a group of deities associated at different times with divine ancestry, assembly, fate, and in some later traditions, the underworld. They are important, but not always in the same way, and not always with a simple job description. That complexity is part of the charm. You are not dealing with a single book written once by one author with a tidy map in the back. You are dealing with centuries of ritual life, local cults, changing empires, and scribes who inherited older material and adjusted it for new audiences. One interpretation is that the gods in these texts seem human because humans naturally describe power in familiar terms. A careful reading might suggest that when ancient people imagined divine beings eating and resting, they were not exposing a secret weakness in heaven, but reflecting the daily structure of their own world. In a city where grain had to be stored, bread had to be baked, canals had to be maintained, and even kings relied on servants, maybe it made sense to imagine the sacred realm as a magnified household with divine needs. And what if the story is pointing at something else? What if these apparently small details, the meal, the bed, the pause, the offering, are not throwaway decoration at all? What if the mystery is not in what we know, but in what we can't confirm? You sit with that for a moment as incense drifts through a temple corridor and the evening air begins to cool. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. We are not proving anything tonight, we're following clues. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian religion was deeply tied to temples, and temples were not abstract places. They were economic centers, storage hubs, ritual sites, and political symbols. A temple was where grain moved, where offerings were counted, where priests and workers performed daily acts of care for the divine presence. Archaeology suggests that gods were not treated as distant ideas alone. Their statues were clothed, washed, perfumed, and offered food and drink. That does not necessarily mean the people of Sumer thought a stone statue literally chewed barley bread in the dark when no one was looking. A more cautious explanation could be that the statue served as the visible focal point of a living divine presence, and that feeding it helped maintain order between city and cosmos. Still, you can feel why later readers raise an eyebrow. If the gods are receiving meals, if they are being put to bed in sacred chambers, if their comfort matters to the stability of the world, then they begin to sound less like untouchable abstractions and more like rulers with routines. Historians still argue whether those routines were understood as purely symbolic, partly literal within ritual logic, or simply poetic ways of speaking about divine human reciprocity. There is no full consensus, because the texts do not always pause to explain themselves to a future audience with electric lights and questionable sleep schedules. And that is where the first section of the mystery settles into place. The question is not really whether Mesopotamian people were naive enough to think the universe ran on snack breaks. That would be too easy, and frankly, a little rude to one of the most sophisticated early civilizations on Earth. The deeper question is why these stories and rituals so often give divine beings habits that look familiar. Why imagine heavenly powers in ways that seem bound to appetite, labor, and rest? Why preserve myths where gods complain, deliberate, and seem burdened by the management of creation itself? One documented anchor is simple and solid. Ancient Mesopotamians wrote down myths in which gods act in ways that resemble powerful persons, rather than abstract cosmic principles. One interpretation is that this reflects a social world built on hierarchy, labor, and provision, where even the highest authority depended on an ordered household. And in the softer, cinematic edge of the night, What if the oldest scribes were preserving a memory, not of aliens or fallen supermen exactly, but of a much stranger intuition? That power, even sacred power, was imagined as something that could become tired. You keep walking under the shadow of the ziggurat, with the smell of oil lamps and baked clay around you, and the question follows like soft footsteps. Not whether the gods were secretly human, not yet, and not in any simple sense. Just whether the stories wanted their listeners to notice that divine greatness in Mesopotamia did not always mean divine distance. Sometimes it may have meant the opposite. Sometimes the gods come close enough to need a room, a ritual, a meal, and perhaps, by the hush of evening, a little rest. You linger near that same temple threshold, where the baked brick still gives off the day's stored warmth, and the air carries a mixture of barley mash, lamp oil, and something sweet from a tray left at the shrine. The closer you move into the practical rhythm of Mesopotamian worship, the less the divine world looks like a distant cloud palace, and the more it resembles an estate that must be kept running on schedule. Most historians agree that temples in ancient Sumer and later Mesopotamia were not only religious buildings, but major economic institutions, with storehouses, workshops, kitchens, fields, herds, administrators, and laborers tied to their upkeep. Archaeology suggests that offerings of food and drink were a normal part of temple life, not a strange side note, and this is where the old question grows sharper. If the gods receive meals every day, what exactly is being fed? What's broadly accepted is that cult statues stood at the center of many temple rituals. These were not casual decorations sitting around collecting dust like unfortunate gym equipment in January. They were treated as the visible locus of divine presence. Priests washed them, clothed them, adorned them with jewelry, presented meals before them, and in some contexts placed them in carefully arranged inner chambers. That ritual care is documented in texts and reflected in the architecture and administrative records surrounding temple life. The evidence we do have points to a worldview in which divine presence and material ritual are closely connected. The statue is crafted matter, yes, but it is also more than matter once consecrated. One interpretation is that feeding the god's image was part of maintaining the bond between city and deity, not because the stone body needed calories in the ordinary sense, but because the ritual act itself nourished order. And yet, when you hear that explanation while staring at rows of bread, jars of beer, cuts of meat, and bowls of dates being brought into a sacred room, it is hard not to feel the tug of a more literal imagination. A careful reading might suggest that ancient worshippers did not always separate symbol and reality as neatly as modern readers prefer. That's a possibility, not a certainty. In ritual thinking, an offering can be both symbolic and real at once. The god may consume the essence, aroma, or divine portion, while the physical remains are later redistributed among temple staff. The meal is not wasted, and the ritual is not pretend. It operates inside a logic where scent, presentation, and sacred attention matter. If you are tempted to ask whether the gods were basically surviving on perfume and vibes, that is understandable, though perhaps not the most respectful way to phrase it inside a shrine. Still, the daily regularity is striking. Meals are prepared at appointed times, vessels are cleaned, tables are arranged, incense rises, doors open and close with ceremony. This is not spontaneous spirituality, it is scheduled hospitality. Most historians agree that this routine reflects the central role of reciprocity in Mesopotamian religion. Humans serve the gods through offerings, songs, maintenance, and devotion. In return, the gods protect the city, preserve fertility, and hold chaos at bay. A more cautious explanation could be that divine hunger in these systems is really a way of speaking about dependence within that covenant. The gods do not need nutrition in a biological sense. Rather, the relationship itself must be fed. But historians still argue whether the language of divine feeding was understood by ancient people as purely ceremonial or as a more immediate reality within the sacred frame. Some scholars lean toward symbolism, especially because many cultures speak of gods eating offerings without implying literal digestion. Others point out that Mesopotamian ritual texts often take the daily comfort of the deity with extraordinary seriousness, and that seriousness may reflect more than metaphor. There's no full consensus, and the ambiguity is part of what keeps these tablets alive in the imagination. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. You can see why temple economies became so vast. If a city's well-being depends on keeping divine households supplied, then religion is not a weekend hobby. It is infrastructure. Grain must be harvested. Beer must be brewed. Animals must be raised. Bakers, brewers, shepherds, administrators, and scribes all become tiny cogs in a machine designed, at least in part, to ensure that heaven never misses lunch. Archaeology suggests that temples owned land, managed workers, and received goods through systems that were both sacred and bureaucratic. This is one of those moments when the ancient world feels hilariously familiar. Somewhere behind the incense and hymns, someone is still doing inventory, and that practical structure may help explain why stories of gods with human-like needs felt so natural. If your city's most sacred institution is organized like a palace household, complete with kitchens, storerooms, sleeping chambers, and attendants, then your image of the divine may naturally follow the same shape. One interpretation is that Mesopotamian religion projected the political world upward. Gods rule like kings. They dwell in houses. They receive tribute. They issue commands. They rest in private chambers. They require service. That does not reduce belief to politics, but it does suggest that the human experience of hierarchy gave form to the sacred imagination. A fringe idea proposes that these patterns preserve a memory of beings who were not fully transcendent at all, but rather powerful entities bound to physical routines, eventually mythologized into gods. This theory isn't widely accepted, but you can understand its appeal. When later readers encounter divine meal schedules and resting places, they sometimes feel as though they are peeking behind the curtain at rulers who were grand, yes, but not endless or self-sustaining. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, the idea becomes less a declaration and more a mood. What if the temple meal is not just theater? What if it echoes a much older intuition that the highest beings were once imagined as vulnerable to lack? Let me rephrase that more carefully. We do not need to assume literal, vulnerable super beings in order to see that Mesopotamian religion often pictured divine life in concrete terms. That solid ground is enough to stand on. The temple meal tells you that sacred power was expected to be hosted, attended, and refreshed. Whether that means literal dependence, ritual dependence, or symbolic reciprocity is debated. But the pattern itself is clear. These were not absent gods who drifted beyond human reach. They were present powers who had to be welcomed properly, fed properly, honored properly, and perhaps soothed properly. As night deepens around the temple, the whole place begins to feel less like a monument and more like a residence. Footsteps soften. A last tray is lifted. A priest murmurs through a learned formula older than many kingdoms. Oil light trembles against the wall. The god has been served. The city, for one more evening, has done its part. And in that quiet, another clue settles beside the first. If divine meals are woven into the center of urban life, then stories of tired, eating, resting gods are not random oddities. They are part of the same architecture of dependence that shaped the temple itself. One documented anchor is the enormous economic role of Mesopotamian temples and their ritual feeding of divine statues. One interpretation is that these acts expressed a sacred relationship that had to be maintained like a household. And in the dim, cinematic space just behind certainty, what if every offering tray was carrying an unsettling implication? That even the beings above humanity could not remain comfortably themselves without being served. You move outward from the temple kitchens and into the older, stranger layer beneath the ritual, where myth begins to explain why the whole machine of service exists in the first place. The trays of bread and beer make more sense once you hear the deeper complaint buried in Mesopotamian tradition, a complaint that sounds less like thunder from heaven and more like a labor strike in a swamp. Most historians agree that in the Antrahasis tradition and related Mesopotamian material, the creation of humanity is tied to divine work, burden, and unrest. Before human beings are shaped for service, the gods themselves are pictured as carrying out exhausting tasks. Archaeology suggests these stories emerged from a culture intensely aware of irrigation labor, agricultural management, and social hierarchy. And one interpretation is that the myth turns ordinary toil into a cosmic backstory. What if the first great religious idea here is not abstract perfection, but divine overwork? That sounds almost funny at first, and perhaps a little comforting if you have ever stared at your own to-do list like it was a punishment from the heavens. But in Mesopotamia, labor is not a small matter. You are standing in a land where canals must be dug and cleared, embankments repaired, fields organized, mud brick formed, grain stored, and herds managed with relentless regularity. What's broadly accepted is that southern Mesopotamian life depended on coordinated work against a difficult environment. Rivers brought fertility, yes, but also instability. Water had to be directed, watched, and negotiated with. A city did not simply happen. It had to be maintained every day, or the mud, reeds, heat, and flooding would remind everyone who was really in charge. So when certain myths describe lower-ranking gods doing the heavy labor of the world before humans exist, the image lands with real force. The evidence we do have points to a mythic structure in which divine beings, often framed as lesser or worker gods in relation to higher divine authorities, become weary of their toil. They dig canals, they maintain the earth, they carry the burden of order. Eventually they rebel, or at least protest loudly enough that the divine council must respond. One interpretation is that this reflects human social realities projected upward. In a society where labor supports elites, The cosmos itself is imagined as having once run on the backs of workers until a new labor force is invented. That is a possibility, not a certainty, but it is a very strong one. And here the gods stop looking like untouchable, glowing abstractions and start resembling a palace administration under pressure. They argue, they grumble, they reach a breaking point. It is possible that the myth is not trying to diminish the gods, but to make sense of how an ordered world is sustained. If even heaven depends on work, then labor is not a punishment invented later by kings and tax collectors. It is built into creation itself. That is either profound or extremely discouraging, depending on your feelings about deadlines. A careful reading might suggest something else as well. The gods in these stories are not merely choosing to act human for poetic flair. Their very situation is structured around fatigue and need. They are burdened beings inside a functioning universe. They can command, yes, but they also seem to be constrained by the sheer demands of maintenance. This raises the possibility that ancient storytellers imagined divine power as real but not unlimited in the way later philosophical religions sometimes describe it. Let me rephrase that more carefully. Mesopotamian gods are immensely powerful within their world, but many texts do not present them as beings beyond all limitation. They operate, rule, quarrel, decide, and suffer strain. That is suggestive, not conclusive, but it matters. A popular rumor claims that such stories preserve a garbled memory of advanced beings forced to work on Earth before engineering humans to replace them. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it thrives because the labor motif is genuinely unusual to modern ears. Why would gods need relief workers unless they had limitations of some kind? A more cautious explanation could be that the myth dramatizes the origin of human purpose in terms ancient audiences would immediately understand. Humanity exists to serve, because service already structured the world they knew. Kings were served, temples were served, households were served, canals were served, if you want to be poetic about it. So the gods too receive service. Still, historians still argue whether the laboring gods of these myths should be read mainly as literary devices, social allegory, or reflections of a more direct theological imagination in which divine beings truly occupied a world of effort and replenishment. Scholars continue to debate the balance. Some emphasize political ideology, others focus on ritual background. Others note that myth often preserves emotional truths without requiring literal interpretation. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. And what we cannot fully confirm is how an ancient listener felt when hearing that the gods themselves had once grown tired of working the land. Try to picture it in the soft half-light of a reed marsh at dawn. Mud presses underfoot. Mosquitoes are already beginning their career in annoyance. Water channels glimmer like dull metal. The air smells of silt and wet plants. In a mythic register, divine workers move through this landscape performing necessary, repetitive labor, not because they are weak in some crude sense, but because the world itself requires effort to keep it shaped. What if the story is pointing at something else? What if behind the rebellion of the gods lies a subtle recognition that order always has a cost, whether in heaven or on earth? Most historians agree that myths of creation often tell you as much about human society as about cosmic origins. In Mesopotamia, that human society is intensely organized, yet permanently fragile. One flood, one failed canal, one political collapse, and the whole arrangement trembles. So, perhaps the myth of overworked gods does not reduce the divine to tired bureaucrats. Perhaps it elevates human work into something sacred by giving it a heavenly precedent. If divine beings once labored, then your own labor belongs to the structure of reality, unpleasant though that may be when your job involves hauling mud in summer. And from the angle of tonight's question, this section matters for a simple reason. If the gods can become burdened, then rest begins to make sense. If they require relief, then the later rhythms of feeding, tending, and honoring them in temples seem less random. One interpretation is that the temple system preserves a ritual answer to a mythic problem. The gods once labored. Humans were created, in part, to assume that burden. From then on, human service helps sustain divine order. Bread on the altar and songs in the sanctuary are not isolated gestures. They belong to a much older logic of substitution and support. So, you carry that forward as the night settles deeper over the plain. The first clue was that gods in Mesopotamian stories sometimes seem close enough to need meals and rooms. The second was that temples serve them with astonishing regularity. Now a third clue joins them, heavy as wet clay in your hands. One documented anchor is the Mesopotamian mythic tradition in which divine labor precedes human creation. One interpretation is that these stories mirror a world where work and hierarchy define existence, and in the cinematic hush just beyond the lamp glow. What if the earliest memory tucked into these texts is not of perfect beings descending from beyond all need, but of sacred powers who became tired enough to make someone else do the digging? That burden now presses toward a solution, and in Mesopotamian myth, the solution is you, or rather, humanity in general, which is a little rude when you think about it. You are not introduced as the crown of creation in the soft, flattering way some later traditions prefer. You arrive as an answer to a workload problem. Most historians agree that in the Atrahasis epic and related Mesopotamian traditions, human beings are created after divine unrest, with the practical purpose of taking over labor that had previously fallen to lesser gods. What's broadly accepted is that this is one of the clearest and most striking creation motifs in the ancient Near East. Archaeology suggests these stories grew within societies built on organized work, temple obligation, and layered hierarchy. And one interpretation is that the creation of humanity reflects those realities with almost unsettling honesty. What if the breath placed into human life begins not in pure celebration, but in a tired emergency meeting among the gods? The story, in its broad outline, is famous for good reason. Divine workers become exhausted. Complaint rises. A higher divine council responds. Then, through a dramatic act involving divine substance and earthly matter, humans are fashioned to bear the toil. The evidence we do have points to a mythic model where creation is not random and not purely artistic. It is functional. Human life is designed to serve. That does not mean Mesopotamian people believed human existence was worthless. Let me rephrase that more carefully. It means the myth gives humanity a purpose rooted in service, labor, and ritual maintenance, rather than independent self-glorification. In that world, usefulness and sacred duty are not opposites. They are woven together. One interpretation is that this myth transforms social hierarchy into cosmic memory. In an ancient city, labor supports temple and palace. Food moves upward. Orders move downward. Ritual binds everything together. So the story of human creation folds those same patterns into the structure of existence itself. If people serve gods, it is because people were made to do so. A more cautious explanation could be that the myth provides ideological reassurance for a demanding civilization. Work is not arbitrary. It belongs to the original shape of things. You may not love that answer if you are ankle-deep in canal mud at sunrise, but it does offer a kind of grim elegance. And yet the story is not purely mechanical. There is something more intimate and strange in the way humans are fashioned. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian creation myths often involve a mixture of clay and divine essence, especially in the hypotheses tradition, where a slain god's substance becomes part of humanity's making. The details vary across texts and retellings, but the larger pattern is clear enough. Human beings are not merely molded from earth like simple pottery. They are shaped from earth, infused with something that links them to the divine sphere. That is documented in the broad mythic tradition, though the meaning of it is debated. Historians still argue whether this divine ingredient should be understood mainly as a poetic explanation for human consciousness, a theological statement about service and kinship, or a ritual literary device meant to dramatize the sacred seriousness of labor. Scholars continue to debate how literally such elements were taken, and there is no full consensus. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. But even with caution, the image lingers. Humanity is created from a union of mud and divinity, earth and burden, dust and command. That raises the possibility that service to the gods was never imagined as purely external. It could also be inward, woven into the very material of being human. This is where later readers sometimes slide toward dramatic conclusions. A fringe idea proposes that the story encodes a memory of engineered workers made from earthly biology and higher intelligence, eventually remembered as human beings. This theory isn't widely accepted, and the mainstream evidence does not require it. Still, if we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it helps reveal why the myth remains so gripping. The tale already contains the ingredients of modern fascination: powerful beings, crisis, design, hybrid substance, and a practical motive for creation. You do not need aliens for the story to feel uncanny. Ancient Mesopotamia handled uncanny just fine on its own. A careful reading might suggest that the deeper tension in the story is not about science fiction-style origins at all. It may be about the discomforting closeness between gods and humans. If humanity carries divine substance yet is made for labor, then the line between ruler and servant becomes oddly intimate. You are not simply below the gods. You are made from their world, for their world, and perhaps with some trace of their conflict inside you. There is a gentle irony there. Humanity is created to relieve divine stress, and then humans inherit a world full of stress. Congratulations, you are now cosmic customer support. Most historians agree that ancient myths often express difficult truths about society through dramatic origin stories. In this case, the difficult truth may be that every ordered world rests on somebody's effort. Fields do not water themselves. Temples do not provision themselves. Kings do not govern by pure charisma, however much they may enjoy pretending otherwise. The myth extends this insight upward. Even the divine realm, in one of Mesopotamia's boldest ideas, required support. And once humans exist, that support becomes your vocation. You plow, carry, bake, build, sing, pour, and maintain. You do in ritual and labor what the weary gods no longer wish to do. What if the story is pointing at something else? What if creation here is not a fall from perfection, but a negotiated compromise between power and necessity? The gods remain mighty, but not detached from need. Humans remain subordinate, but not disconnected from the sacred. The result is a world where divine beings can receive offerings because humans were made, in part, to provide them. Their meals, their temples, their resting spaces, all make more sense now. The service is not an afterthought. It is built into the origin of the relationship. And this matters for tonight's larger question, because it sharpens the image of the Anunnaki and their companions as beings whose authority does not erase dependence. One documented anchor is the Atrahasis tradition, linking human creation to divine unrest and labor relief. One interpretation is that this reflects the social logic of Mesopotamian civilization, where service sustains hierarchy. And in the cinematic quiet of the night, what if the first human breath rises in a reed-lined temple yard while tired gods look on, not as flawless abstractions floating beyond appetite and sleep, but as rulers who have just created a species to keep their world running, and perhaps, at last, let them rest. Now the practical world closes in again, and the myth of labor relief settles into the smell of actual food. You move from the divine council and the shaping of humanity back into the city itself, where ovens glow, grain is ground, and beer jars line the storerooms like patient brown sentries. If ancient gods were imagined as receiving service, then the things they receive are not mysterious starlight or abstract devotion alone. They are bread, beer, oil, dates, meat, and the ordinary staples of Mesopotamian life. Most historians agree that bread and beer stood at the center of daily existence in ancient Sumer and later Mesopotamia. Archaeology suggests that cereal agriculture, especially barley, supported both everyday survival and temple economies. And one interpretation is that gods who receive the same staples as humans are being imagined through the language of familiar sustenance. What if eternity, at least in these old cities, smells not like ozone and lightning, but like warm barley and baking clay? This is one of those places where the ancient world becomes wonderfully specific. You do not need to picture some vague, holy feast drifting through a mythic cloud. You can almost taste the gritty bread, dense and dark, and the thick beer, cloudy and nourishing. More meal than beverage by modern standards. You probably would not survive this menu with your current snack preferences, especially if you are secretly hoping for iced coffee and a pastry with suspiciously modern levels of butter. What's broadly accepted is that bread and beer were the backbone of the Mesopotamian table. They fed laborers, supported households, appeared in rations, and entered temple offerings. The evidence we do have points to a culture in which food was practical, symbolic, and deeply social, all at once. That matters because when temples present gods with the same core foods that sustain human communities, a strong impression takes shape. The divine realm is not floating far above ordinary life. It is being served through the basic products of agriculture and labor. A careful reading might suggest that the gods are woven into the same cycle of planting, harvesting, grinding, brewing, and offering that structures human existence. That's a possibility, not a certainty, but it is difficult to miss the intimacy of the pattern. The city feeds the temple. The temple feeds the god. The god, in turn, is expected to preserve the city. Round and round it goes, like a cosmic arrangement held together by barley and good manners. Most historians agree that offerings were not random luxury treats, but part of a regularized system of worship. Bread, beer, and other provisions were scheduled, measured, prepared, and presented in ways that reflected both devotion and administration. Archaeology suggests that temples functioned through detailed economic management, which means divine feeding was not just poetry. It was built into real institutional life. One interpretation is that this routine turned agricultural abundance into visible order. If the god's table is full, the city is functioning. If the city is functioning, the canals, fields, storehouses, and social hierarchy are all doing their jobs. In that sense, a loaf on an altar may carry more political weight than a king's speech, though admittedly with fewer dramatic hand gestures. And here the old question deepens again. If gods receive bread and beer, are we meant to imagine them as truly hungry? A more cautious explanation could be that these foods operate as tokens of dependence and relationship rather than biological necessity. Yet the persistent concreteness of the offerings remains striking. They are not simply ideas, they are prepared things, things that take time and effort, things that come from labor. This raises the possibility that divine appetite in Mesopotamian religion was understood less as metabolism and more as rightful provision. The god deserves to be fed because the god is the lord of the house, the city, the land. Feeding is a recognition of status, but also perhaps a recognition of need within the ritual frame. Historians still argue whether these practices reflect symbolic communication alone, or whether ancient worshippers experienced them as meeting a real requirement of divine presence. There's no full consensus. Some scholars stress the ceremonial aspect, noting that many religious traditions offer food to gods without implying literal dining. Others point out that Mesopotamian texts and rituals often speak of divine pleasure, anger, absence, or favor in ways that make neglect of offerings sound genuinely dangerous. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. Did the food nourish the god, represent the city's loyalty, or do both at once inside a world where symbol and reality were not neatly separated? If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. Here, the evidence is rich enough to show the practice clearly, but not rich enough to flatten all ambiguity. A fringe idea proposes that these meal traditions preserve memory of beings who were once thought to need actual earthly provisions, later idealized into full divinity. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it survives because food is hard to spiritualize completely. The smell of bread is stubbornly physical. Beer froths in a real cup. Dates wrinkle in a real bowl. Meat roasts over a real fire. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, the theory simply amplifies an existing tension. Mesopotamian gods often feel embodied in a way that later readers find startling. Let me rephrase that more carefully. We do not need to assume literal divine digestion to notice that the old rituals imagine sacred beings through bodily terms. Gods are washed, dressed, perfumed, seated, fed, and housed. That cluster of actions suggests not abstract perfection floating beyond all matter, but a modeled presence brought near through human care. One interpretation is that the temple creates a meeting point where heaven borrows the grammar of the human household. Meals become the language of proximity, and perhaps that is why bread and beer matter so much in the night atmosphere of these stories. They are ordinary enough to feel intimate and ancient enough to feel sacred. They carry the labor of farmers, millers, bakers, brewers, porters, and priests. They are what the city can spare and what the city cannot afford to neglect. The god's meal is the city's self-offering in edible form. What if the story is pointing at something else? What if divine need here is really about the vulnerability of order itself? As long as the bread arrives, the lamps are lit, and the beer is poured, the bond holds. Stop the routine, and everything begins to tremble. So the motif grows clearer as you walk deeper into the old Mesopotamian evening. One documented anchor is the central role of bread and beer in both daily life and temple offerings. One interpretation is that gods receiving the same staples as humans reflects a sacred relationship, framed through familiar household provision. And in the cinematic warmth of firelight against mud brick walls, what if the real shock is not that the gods had meals, but that ancient people imagined cosmic power sitting close enough to the human table that the smell of fresh barley could reach it? The bread has been set down, the beer poured, the incense lifted in slow blue threads, and now the temple grows quieter in a different way. Not empty, not abandoned, but hushed, as if the building itself is preparing to breathe more slowly. You follow that change inward, past the public courtyards and storerooms, beyond the areas of bustle and offering, toward the intimate spaces at the heart of the sacred complex. Most historians agree that major Mesopotamian temples were structured around inner rooms associated with the god's presence, and that these spaces were treated with extraordinary care and restriction. Archaeology suggests that temple architecture was designed not only for grand ritual display, but also for privacy, enclosure, and controlled access. And one interpretation is that these inner chambers expressed something very close to divine domesticity. What if behind the gold, incense, and official ceremony, there waited not only a throne room, but a sleeping room? This is where the modern mind sometimes gets a little fidgety. A god with a chamber is one thing. A god with a bed starts to sound almost embarrassingly personal. But the evidence we do have points to a temple culture in which sacred presence was housed, attended, and ritually managed in ways that resemble elite household life. What's broadly accepted is that Mesopotamian temples often included a cella, the central sanctuary where the divine statue resided, and additional rooms connected to ritual use, storage, and the ongoing care of the god's estate. In some contexts, the arrangement of sacred space suggests rhythms of presentation and withdrawal, access and seclusion, as if the deity's presence required not constant public exposure, but intervals of privacy. One interpretation is that this spatial arrangement mirrors palace life. Kings did not live permanently on display in the courtyard. They had inner quarters, guarded thresholds, restricted rooms, private chambers where authority withdrew from the crowd and became invisible for a while. A careful reading might suggest that temples gave the gods the same pattern of high-status living. The divine could appear, receive, and command, but also retreat. That retreat may have symbolized transcendence, yes, but a more cautious explanation could be that it also signaled rest. The god had been served, the god had been clothed and fed, the god now occupied the still center of the house. If that sounds suspiciously like bedtime for heaven, you are not the first to notice. Mesopotamian ritual did not always separate majesty from comfort. The god's image could be treated in ways that suggest bodily care: washed, perfumed, dressed, enthroned, shaded, and placed within a secure, sacred environment. Most historians agree that cult statues were approached as living divine presences within ritual logic, not merely symbolic art objects. That does not mean ancient Mesopotamians thought the statue itself snored on a cedar pillow while priests tiptoed out with candles. Let me rephrase that more carefully. It means the divine presence was hosted through forms of care that make very little sense unless intimacy matters. And intimacy absolutely matters here. Archaeology suggests that temples were not just sites of public sacrifice, but houses of the gods, a phrase that is easy to glide past until you stop and take it seriously. A house requires maintenance. A house has routines. A house contains both ceremonial space and private space. One interpretation is that the temple's architecture encodes a theology of divine nearness. The god is not simply everywhere in an abstract sense. The god dwells here, in this place, within this arrangement of walls, courts, doors, rooms, and thresholds. If divine presence is localized and housed, then rest begins to feel less like a poetic flourish and more like part of the expected order. Historians still argue whether the secluded inner rooms of Mesopotamian temples were understood by worshippers primarily as symbolic space, practical ritual space, or something closer to literal divine habitation. Scholars continue to debate how ordinary temple visitors would have imagined the god's life inside those protected chambers. There's no full consensus because temples speak through architecture and ritual practice more than through neat explanatory labels. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. Did people imagine the deity resting in a way that was concretely real to them? Or was the chamber more like a ritual grammar for sacred withdrawal? That's a possibility, not a certainty. There is also the intriguing question of night itself. In a city lit by oil lamps and moonlight, nighttime changes everything. Public business slows, work recedes, sound softens. The temple, like the household, shifts from display to enclosure. What if the story is pointing at something else? What if the god's chamber is not only about privacy, but about rhythm? Day and night matter in Mesopotamia. Feasts have their times. Offerings have their times. Duties have their times. Why would sacred presence be exempt from rhythm when the whole civilization around it is built on cycles of labor and pause? A fringe idea proposes that these inner rooms preserve a memory of beings thought to require actual sleep or protected recovery, later elevated into mythic divinity. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it echoes the same tension we have been following all night. The old rituals often treat the divine in ways that feel startlingly embodied. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, the theory simply pushes the imagery to its furthest edge. What if the chamber was not merely symbolic seclusion, but part of an ancient intuition that power itself needed withdrawal? The mainstream view is gentler and, honestly, strong enough on its own. Most historians agree that sacred kingship and temple religion in Mesopotamia used the language of household, court, and estate to structure the divine world. Gods had houses because houses were how authority was organized. Gods had attendants because attendants were how authority functioned. Gods had inner chambers because distance, privacy, and controlled access were marks of status. A more cautious explanation could be that rest within the temple is less about biological sleep and more about divine enthronement in stillness, the orderly completion of daily service. That may be the safest ground to stand on, and it is sturdy ground. Still, even on sturdy ground, the mood remains wonderfully strange. You can almost picture the last attendants withdrawing, sandals whispering over worn floors, while the inner chamber settles into darkness scented with oil and cedar. Outside, the city mutters softly in its sleep. Somewhere a dog barks, somewhere a jar is set down. Somewhere a priest completes the last quiet duty of the evening. The god remains within, no longer in public ritual, but not absent either. Hidden, housed, attended, and still. And that stillness matters because it deepens tonight's puzzle. One documented anchor is the presence of inner sanctuaries and carefully managed sacred space at the heart of Mesopotamian temples. One interpretation is that these rooms symbolize divine privacy and perhaps even ritual rest, not just abstract power. And in the cinematic hush of lamplight fading against mud brick, what if the oldest temples were built around a thought, both simple and unsettling, that the beings at the top of the cosmos were imagined not only as rulers to be obeyed, but as presences that needed a quiet room at the end of the day. The room stays quiet, and in that quiet, the question becomes a little sharper, because once you imagine a god being housed, fed, and gently withdrawn from public sight, you have to decide how literally to take any of it. This is where ancient religion becomes slippery in the most interesting way. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian myth and ritual often speak in concrete, bodily language about divine beings, while also operating in a world of symbolism, poetry, and ceremonial logic. Archaeology suggests that ritual actions were performed with great seriousness, not as decorative theater, and one interpretation is that divine hunger in Mesopotamian religion may have been both symbolic and real within the sacred frame at the same time. What if the problem is not that the evidence is confusing, but that we keep trying to force an ancient mindset into a modern either-or? You are used to separating categories very cleanly. Either the gods literally eat, or they do not. Either the statue is a symbol, or it is a body. Either the offering feeds a supernatural being, or it is just a ritual gesture for humans. Mesopotamia is not always interested in helping you keep those boxes tidy. What's broadly accepted is that in many ancient religious systems, rituals did not merely represent a reality from far away. They enacted it. They made it present, stabilized it, renewed it. The evidence we do have points to a temple world in which feeding the god was not understood as empty performance. Something important happened when the meal was set down, the incense rose, the words were spoken, and the inner chamber received its appointed care. One interpretation is that divine eating may have been understood as the consumption of essence rather than matter. The god receives the aroma, the sacred portion, the life of the offering, while the visible food remains available for human handling afterward. A more cautious explanation could be that this is less about digestive biology and more about ritual exchange. The meal belongs to the god first, because the god is the source of order and blessing. Once it has been offered, it becomes part of the temple economy again. That is a possibility, not a certainty, but it helps explain why the practice could be both deeply serious and materially practical. No one is pretending the bread vanished. The point is that the bread has passed through the divine household. Still, the bodily language refuses to disappear. Gods are pleased by proper offerings. They may be angered by neglect. They are said to enjoy pleasing scents. They are served at regular times. These details do not prove literal divine metabolism, and we should not say more than the evidence allows. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. But here the evidence is not thin on the fact of ritual feeding. It is thin only on how ancient minds drew the boundary between symbol and embodied presence. Historians still argue whether Mesopotamian worshippers imagined divine hunger as metaphor, ritual necessity, or some ancient category that does not map neatly onto either modern term. That debate matters because it changes how you picture the Anunnaki and related divine figures. If hunger is purely symbolic, then the gods remain fundamentally unlike humans, merely using household language to structure divine human relations. If hunger is, within ritual logic, something like a real need, then the gods become more dependent, more relational, perhaps more vulnerable than later theological systems might allow. There's no full consensus. Scholars continue to debate the point because Mesopotamian religion leaves room for layered meaning. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. We'll keep the solid ground separate from the mist. And there is another issue tucked inside this one. Most historians agree that fear of divine displeasure was a real part of Mesopotamian religion. Ritual neglect could be dangerous, not necessarily because people imagined a god collapsing from missed lunch, but because offerings and service helped maintain the bond between city and deity. A careful reading might suggest that the real danger of divine hunger lies in broken reciprocity. If the god is not fed, honored, soothed, and kept in proper comfort, then protection may falter, crops may fail, enemies may threaten, illness may spread. A more cautious explanation could be that divine need and human duty are so tightly linked in the system that one stands in for the other. The god must be fed because the relationship must not be allowed to starve. This is also where the old temptation toward dramatic fringe readings comes strolling back in, wearing cosmic robes and trying very hard to look mysterious. A fringe idea proposes that the repeated emphasis on feeding and resting the gods preserves memory of beings once thought to be physically present rulers with ordinary biological constraints. This theory isn't widely accepted, and the mainstream evidence does not require it. But if we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it highlights something real in the texts. Mesopotamian gods are often imagined through the vocabulary of presence, pleasure, comfort, and provision. They may not be biologically human, but they are not always portrayed as beyond every category of need either. Let me rephrase that more carefully. The safest conclusion is not that the gods literally depended on calories in a modern sense. The safest conclusion is that Mesopotamian religion presented divine power as something that had to be ritually maintained through bodily forms of service. That is already a remarkable idea. It means sacred authority was not only adored from a distance, it was hosted. The city did not merely believe in its god. The city looked after its god's house, table, clothing, and inner peace. You can see why temple workers mattered so much. In a way, they were caretakers of cosmic stability, which is a rather glamorous title for people who also had to worry about bread inventories. What if the story is pointing at something else? What if the bodily language of divine need was meant to remind humans that power is never truly self-sustaining inside the world of cities and rituals? Even the highest beings, as imagined here, belong to networks of service. Kings need attendants, temples need workers, fields need irrigation, gods need offerings. That pattern may say less about weakness than about interdependence. Ancient Mesopotamia rarely imagines existence as isolated. Everything is bound in obligation, so the silence in the inner chamber grows more meaningful, not less. One documented anchor is the seriousness of Mesopotamian ritual feeding and the concrete language used for divine enjoyment and service. One interpretation is that divine hunger may have functioned as a sacred reality of relationship rather than simple metaphor or simple biology. And in the cinematic stillness of that lamp-lit room, what if the real mystery is not whether the gods ate literally, but whether ancient people understood the whole universe as a household where even the beings above humanity had to be kept content if the night was to remain calm? From that hushed inner room, your attention shifts outward again, not away from the god, but toward the people responsible for keeping everything from slipping into disorder. Because once divine presence is treated as something that must be hosted, soothed, fed, clothed, and ritually maintained, you immediately run into the figure standing between heaven and the storeroom ledger, the king. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian rulers presented themselves not merely as military leaders or tax collectors, but as caretakers of temples and guarantors of proper relations with the gods. Archaeology suggests that royal inscriptions, building projects, and ritual patronage tied kingship closely to divine service. And one interpretation is that earthly government in Mesopotamia partly existed to keep the sacred household functioning. What if empire, at least in one ancient sense, begins as a very elaborate attempt to make sure the gods are comfortable on time? That sounds slightly less glamorous than the usual royal propaganda, which prefers eagles, conquest, and dramatic jawlines carved into stone. But the evidence we do have points to a model of kingship rooted in maintenance as much as majesty. What's broadly accepted is that Mesopotamian kings built temples, restored shrines, endowed offerings, organized labor, and publicly emphasized their duty to honor and serve the gods. They did not usually claim to be gods in the same way Egyptian pharaohs could be framed. Instead, especially in Sumerian and Akkadian traditions, rulers often stood as chosen servants, representatives, stewards, or beloved agents of divine authority. One interpretation is that this role made the king the chief house manager of cosmic order. Less a detached emperor floating above the system, more the senior administrator who absolutely cannot let the grain deliveries fail. And that role matters because it suggests divine need was not a marginal poetic detail. If kings devote enormous energy to temple provisioning and restoration, then feeding, housing, and honoring the gods sits at the center of public order. A more cautious explanation could be that temple service was politically useful because it displayed piety, legitimacy, and generosity. Of course, that is true as well. Kings are rarely allergic to publicity. Still, the practical scale of royal engagement with sacred institutions suggests more than image management. Archaeology reveals repeated temple reconstructions, dedicatory inscriptions, and administrative systems designed to sustain cult activity across generations. The gods' table was not symbolic in the sense of being optional. It was part of the machinery of civilization. Historians still argue whether Mesopotamian kings understood themselves primarily as servants of divine will, managers of temple economies, or ritual performers enacting a necessary public theology. There's no full consensus because ancient kingship is never just one thing. It is theater, coercion, devotion, bureaucracy, diplomacy, and sacred symbolism all rolled together like a mud brick with delusions of grandeur. But the debate itself helps clarify tonight's puzzle. If the king's legitimacy depends in part on caring for divine households, then the gods are imagined less as distant ideals and more as presences with concrete claims on human labor. The city does not merely honor them with thoughts and feelings, it budgets for them. You can feel this especially when you picture the royal restoration inscriptions, those proud announcements that a neglected temple has been rebuilt, a forgotten offering reinstated, a sacred chamber restored to proper beauty. Most historians agree that these inscriptions often present temple repair as a moral and cosmic necessity. A careful reading might suggest that ruined shrines signaled more than civic decay. They suggested a breakdown in the relationship between ruler, city, and God. If the divine house falls into disrepair, then order itself begins to look fragile. What if the king is so anxious to rebuild because the issue is not only prestige, but fear that neglected gods become dangerous gods? That fear does not necessarily mean people thought the gods were weak. Let me rephrase that more carefully. It does not mean divine beings were imagined as helpless without human help. It means their favor, presence, and proper placement within the civic world required human participation. A more cautious explanation could be that temple care maintained the channels through which divine blessing flowed. But to later readers, especially those interested in the Anunnaki as possibly more embodied than later theological ideals allow, the pattern remains suggestive. Kings serve the gods with food, building, clothing, ritual attention, and regular maintenance. That raises the possibility that sacred order in Mesopotamia was imagined almost like a courtly ecosystem. Everyone has a role, everyone has obligations, even heaven, in a sense, is institutional. A fringe idea proposes that this preservation of divine households by human rulers reflects memory of an older arrangement in which powerful beings required literal material support, and kings inherited the duty of managing those supports after the beings themselves became more remote. This theory isn't widely accepted, but you can see why it persists. The old texts do not speak like abstract philosophy. They speak like administration. The gods have houses. The houses need care. The king is judged on whether he performs that care. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, the theory simply pushes the evidence toward its most dramatic edge. The mainstream view, though, is compelling enough without cosmic embellishment. Most historians agree that ancient Mesopotamian religion fused politics and ritual because both were concerned with order, hierarchy, and provision. One interpretation is that the king's responsibility to the gods reflected the same basic truth as the myths of labor and the rituals of feeding. Power, even sacred power, exists within structures of maintenance. The ruler maintains the temple. The temple maintains the bond with the god. The god maintains the city's well-being. Break one link and anxiety spreads through the whole chain. What if the story is pointing at something else? What if kingship here is not merely a reflection of divine order, but an admission that divine order is fragile enough to need management? That is a daring thought, so we should handle it carefully. It may be too strong to say Mesopotamians believed their gods would simply fail without upkeep. That goes beyond the evidence. But it is not too strong to say they acted as though divine favor had to be cultivated constantly through human effort, and that rulers bore a special burden in that process. If the gods were fed and rested through temple routine, then the king was partly responsible for making sure the routine never stopped. So as the night air cools and torchlight thins against the temple walls, the figure of the ruler comes into softer focus. Not just conqueror, not just judge, but steward of sacred comfort. One documented anchor is the central royal role in building, restoring, and provisioning Mesopotamian temples. One interpretation is that kingship itself helped sustain a divine order imagined in household terms, with real attention to the gods' ongoing care. And in the cinematic quiet of an ancient city settling to sleep, what if the crown weighs so heavily because, beneath all the ceremony, the ruler knows his kingdom depends on keeping even the highest beings well supplied, well housed, and at peace through the night? The night is calmer now, but not entirely safe, because Mesopotamian stories have a habit of lowering their voice right before something enormous goes wrong. You have seen the gods fed, housed, and supported. You have watched kings build systems to keep sacred order from wobbling. And then the myths turn toward flood, toward noise, toward regret, and suddenly the divine world does not look serene at all. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian flood traditions, especially those preserved in Atrahasis and later echoed in the Epic of Gilgamesh, portray the gods reacting to human affairs with anxiety, division, and aftershock. Archaeology suggests that flood memory in Mesopotamia was shaped by a landscape deeply vulnerable to river disaster, and one interpretation is that these myths picture divine beings as far more emotionally and situationally vulnerable than later ideas of perfect gods might allow. What if the storm reveals not flawless cosmic minds, but powers that become overwhelmed by the consequences of their own decisions? This is where the old stories become strangely intimate again. The flood is not always framed as a majestic act of calm judgment descending from unreachable perfection. In parts of the Mesopotamian tradition, the divine realm itself trembles during the event. What's broadly accepted is that in Atrahasis, the gods are disturbed by human noise and population growth, a detail that has launched 1,000 dramatic retellings and at least several unnecessary modern jokes about noisy neighbors. The evidence we do have points to a mythic sequence in which divine frustration leads to escalating attempts at restraint, and finally to catastrophic flooding. Yet once the disaster unfolds, the gods do not all stand above it with cold detachment. Some recoil, some grieve, some appear frightened by the scale of what has been unleashed. That detail matters more than it first seems to. If the gods in these stories can be distressed by their own storm, then they do not fit neatly into the category of beings beyond reaction, beyond discomfort, beyond consequence. One interpretation is that Mesopotamian myth preserves a divine world full of internal tension, where major beings possess immense authority but not perfect unity or serenity. A careful reading might suggest that the flood reveals a familiar pattern. The gods command great power, but they also suffer strain, indecision, and emotional exposure. That's a possibility, not a certainty, but it is one of the most compelling features of the tradition. Most historians agree that ancient flood stories often compress environmental fear, moral order, and cultural memory into one dramatic narrative. In Mesopotamia, that compression feels especially vivid because flood was not abstract. Rivers could nourish life and destroy it in the same broad gesture. Archaeology suggests that life in southern Mesopotamia required constant water management, and the threat of excess water would have been deeply familiar. A more cautious explanation could be that the divine alarm in flood stories reflects human alarm projected onto the gods. If society feels vulnerable, the heavens in story may feel vulnerable too. But even if that is the case, the result is striking. The gods are not untouched by disaster. They participate in panic. Historians still argue whether the emotional language surrounding the gods in flood traditions should be read mainly as literary drama, theological realism, or symbolic reflection of human fragility. There's no full consensus. Scholars continue to debate how literally ancient audiences imagined divine fear or regret in such scenes. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. We'll keep the solid ground separate from the mist. Still, the texts themselves leave room for a haunting thought. Power in Mesopotamian myth is not always calm. Sometimes it is reactive, crowded, and visibly strained. And that matters for tonight's question, because beings who can be distressed, burdened, and thrown into disarray begin to look less like self-sufficient abstractions and more like rulers within a volatile system. You can imagine the old temple logic here in sharper form. If the gods themselves can become upset, then ritual care is not just decorative politeness. It becomes a way of preserving calm at the highest level. Offerings, hymns, correct service, proper rest, and orderly devotion all help sustain a relationship with powers that are mighty but not emotionally remote. What if the story is pointing at something else? What if flood myth is the place where Mesopotamia quietly admits that divine authority can become destabilized? There is also the unforgettable detail of divine regret after the flood, especially in versions where the surviving human's offering draws the gods like flies around sacrifice, a vivid and slightly undignified image that later readers never quite forget. Most historians agree that this scene is central to the Mesopotamian flood tradition. The evidence we do have points to a moment when the gods, deprived of human offerings during the destruction, gather eagerly around the restored ritual meal. One interpretation is that this reflects the old logic of reciprocity in its starkest possible form. Without humans, the gods lose their service. Without service, something in the cosmic arrangement is missing. That is suggestive, not conclusive, but it directly supports the broader pattern we have been tracing. A fringe idea proposes that the flood stories preserve a memory of powerful beings who discovered, too late, that destroying their human support system endangered their own comfort or survival. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it thrives because the old texts themselves contain an awkward, unforgettable truth. The gods do not appear entirely independent from the human world they govern. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, the theory simply dramatizes the reciprocal bond already visible in mainstream readings. Humans need the gods, yes. But the stories sometimes imply that the gods also need humans, whether for offerings, order, praise, or the maintenance of divine dignity. Let me rephrase that more carefully. The safest conclusion is not that Mesopotamian gods would literally starve without people. The safest conclusion is that the tradition repeatedly imagines divine-human relations as mutually structured. Humans serve, feed, and honor. Gods protect, rule, and bless. When that exchange collapses, the texts describe not serene divine independence, but tension and loss. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. How far did ancient listeners feel that dependence went? So you stand in the flood's aftermath, with mud everywhere, the air washed raw, the sacrifice rising again into the sky, and the gods drawing near. One documented anchor is the Mesopotamian flood tradition, in which divine beings react with fear, regret, and renewed interest in offerings. One interpretation is that these scenes portray sacred power as startlingly vulnerable to disruption, not beyond it. And in the cinematic silence after the rain, what if the flood reveals the deepest crack in the old image of divinity? Not that the gods were weak exactly, but that they were imagined as beings who could not destroy the human world without also disturbing their own peace. When the floodwaters withdraw and the sacrificial smoke rises again, you are left with a world that feels more fragile than it did before. Not only because cities can drown, though they certainly can, and not only because divine tempers can tip from irritation to catastrophe, with very little warning, though that is not exactly soothing either. The deeper fragility lies in the fact that everything now seems to depend on continuous care. And nowhere is that clearer than in the sanctuary itself, where the life of the god must be maintained day after day with a patience so steady it almost disappears into routine. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian temples required constant upkeep, both materially and ritually, and that sacred spaces were maintained through repeated acts of cleaning, provisioning, repair, and ceremonial attention. Archaeology suggests that temples were active institutions vulnerable to wear, neglect, political disruption, and environmental damage, and one interpretation is that the old rites of divine comfort took on special weight precisely because sacred presence was imagined as something that could not simply be left unattended. What if the last ember in a shrine was guarding not just a room, but a relationship that could cool if no one kept watch? You can feel this more strongly once you stop picturing temples as static monuments and start picturing them as living places. Mud brick cracks, plaster flakes, roofs leak, doors swell, offerings spoil, lamps go out, incense must be replenished. Priestly personnel need training, supplies, schedules, and support. What's broadly accepted is that temples in Mesopotamia were not timeless stone fantasies, immune to the ordinary annoyances of maintenance. They were physical complexes embedded in real cities, and like all real complexes, they demanded labor. The evidence we do have points to a sacred world in which care was not occasional. It was constant. That practical reality creates a very particular mood, especially at night. During the day, a temple can look grand, official, even overwhelming. But after dusk, when the public bustle fades, the sanctuary feels more exposed. The corridors darken, the shadows lengthen along the walls. A single lamp becomes important in a way daylight never allows. One interpretation is that nightly temple service carried an intensified sense of responsibility. The god's house must remain ordered through the hours when the city quiets and uncertainty grows. A more cautious explanation could be that this simply reflects routine religious discipline, not fear of divine collapse. That is probably the safest phrasing. Still, ritual discipline often tells you what a culture worries about. People do not repeat acts with such care unless they believe something important depends on them. Historians still argue whether the constant maintenance of Mesopotamian sanctuaries primarily expressed reverence, political control, or a deeper anxiety about divine absence. There's no full consensus, and perhaps there never will be. Some scholars emphasize administration and institutional continuity. Others note the emotional and ritual texture of temple life, where daily care seems designed not merely to display power, but to preserve presence. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. Did worshippers fear that a neglected shrine would anger the god, disappoint the god, or somehow fail to hold the god at all? That's a possibility, not a certainty. Yet the intensity of temple upkeep makes the question hard to avoid. This is where ruined sanctuaries become so haunting. Archaeology suggests that across Mesopotamian history, temples were rebuilt, restored, abandoned, repurposed, and mourned as political fortunes changed. A broken shrine was never just broken architecture. It signaled interrupted service, a torn link in the chain between city and divine favor. Most historians agree that royal inscriptions often frame temple restoration as urgent and morally charged, which tells you how serious such neglect could feel. A careful reading might suggest that ruin was not merely civic embarrassment. It was sacred unease. The god's house had fallen silent. The table might be empty. The lamp might be cold. A fringe idea proposes that some ruined sanctuaries preserve traces of forgotten rites designed to comfort or even stabilize divine beings imagined as unusually dependent on human attendance. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it grows in the dark corners of the imagination for understandable reasons. Ruins invite speculation, the way empty halls invite echoes. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, the theory simply exaggerates a mainstream truth. Temples were places where divine presence was expected to be sustained through repeated human action. Once you grant that much, it is easy for later minds to wonder whether the routines were serving something more than symbolism. Let me rephrase that more carefully. We do not need to imagine hidden technologies, secret sleep chambers, or forgotten energy rituals to appreciate how vulnerable sacred order could seem in Mesopotamia. The safer conclusion is enough. Temples needed upkeep because they were houses of the gods, and houses only remain fit for presence through work. Lamps had to be lit, floors had to be cleaned, vessels had to be prepared, food had to be brought, chants had to be remembered. A more cautious explanation could be that the sanctuary's fragility mirrors the fragility of the city itself. Both survive through constant renewal. Both can go silent if neglected. And silence is the right word here. Not just metaphorical silence, but the actual hush of late hours in a shrine where service has slowed to its minimum, and each remaining sound feels deliberate. Somewhere a wick is trimmed. Somewhere a container is set carefully on stone. Somewhere a priest stands in the soft heat, listening for nothing and everything at once. What if the story is pointing at something else? What if this nightly vigilance reveals that ancient people imagined divine comfort not as a permanent condition, but as something continually recreated? The god is at peace because the house is in order. The house is in order because someone stays awake. There is something almost tender in that, though tenderness in Mesopotamian religion rarely gets top billing. Most historians agree that the sacred and the administrative were never far apart in these cities. But administration, when repeated with devotion, becomes care. A bowl placed correctly is care. A chamber swept clean is care. A scheduled offering delivered without fail is care. One interpretation is that temple maintenance formed a kind of quiet theology, a statement made not in abstract doctrine, but in repeated acts. The divine world remains near only if it is properly attended. So, you move through the night watch of the sanctuary with a softer step now, aware that the old stories about eating and resting gods do not float free from architecture or labor. They are built into them. One documented anchor is the continuous material and ritual maintenance required by Mesopotamian temples. One interpretation is that this maintenance expressed more than formality, hinting at a sacred presence that had to be steadied through human care. And in the cinematic glow of one surviving lamp in a darkened shrine, what if the oldest priestly duty was not merely to honor heaven from afar, but to keep the divine household calm enough to make it through the night? From that lone lamp in the sanctuary, your attention drifts toward another kind of chamber entirely. Not the god's inner room this time, but the divine meeting hall imagined in myth. Because Mesopotamian religion does not always picture the Anunnaki and their related powers as isolated, blazing individuals standing alone against the cosmos. Very often they appear in groups, assemblies, councils, and courts. They deliberate, they judge, they witness decrees, they hold rank. Most historians agree that in Mesopotamian texts, the Anunnaki are frequently associated with a collective divine body, sometimes linked to ancestry, sometimes to underworld authority, sometimes to the larger machinery of fate and order. Archaeology suggests that Mesopotamian political life, with its councils, hierarchies, and official roles, shaped how the divine world was imagined. And one interpretation is that the Anunnaki resemble a ruling class with obligations and limits, rather than untouchable beings beyond all structure. What if divine authority here sounds less like a single thunderclap and more like a weary meeting that should have been an email? That image may be slightly unfair to the grandeur of ancient religion, but only slightly. What's broadly accepted is that Mesopotamian gods operate within layered relationships. There are high gods, city gods, family gods, specialized gods, messenger gods, worker gods, and divine collectives whose functions shift across time and place. The evidence we do have points to a sacred world that is administratively crowded. This is not the clean simplicity of one all-encompassing principle. It is a cosmos run like a royal household, a temple network, and a political court all at once. The Anunnaki, in many settings, belong to that courtly logic. They are powerful, yes, but their power is often exercised through assembly rather than solitary perfection. One interpretation is that this collective character explains why Mesopotamian gods can seem both majestic and strangely constrained. A god in a council must negotiate. A god in a hierarchy must share authority. A god in an underworld tribunal must perform function as much as radiate essence. A careful reading might suggest that the Anunnaki are not imagined primarily as infinitely self-sustaining divine flame, but as members of an ordered, ruling body. That is a possibility, not a certainty, but it matters for tonight's question. If the divine world is structured like a court, then needs, duties, and procedures become easier to imagine. Councils convene, judgments are issued, roles are assigned. Even sacred beings have responsibilities, and responsibilities tend to make everyone look a little more tired by sunset. Most historians agree that later Mesopotamian traditions, especially in Akkadian and Babylonian contexts, sometimes connect the Anunnaki strongly with the underworld and with judicial or chthonic functions. That does not mean the term always means the same thing everywhere. Let me rephrase that more carefully. The word shifts across periods and texts, which is one reason modern summaries often oversimplify it. Still, what's broadly accepted is that the Anunnaki are not usually portrayed in mainstream scholarship as a race of hyper-physical super beings stomping around the earth demanding sandwiches. They are divine figures embedded in a broader mythological and ritual framework. And yet, because they are embedded in that framework, they also inherit its human-like features: rank, assembly, place, duty, and relationship. And historians still argue whether the Anunnaki were experienced by worshippers as a sharply defined group with consistent identity, or as a more fluid collective whose meaning changed depending on text, temple, and era. Scholars continue to debate the question because Mesopotamian religion rarely gives modern readers the satisfaction of one fixed answer. There's no full consensus. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. We'll keep the solid ground separate from the mist. But even amid the uncertainty, one thing stands out. The Anunnaki fit comfortably into a world where divine beings are organized, located, and functionally involved in maintaining order. That organizational quality helps explain why they do not always feel like later philosophical notions of pure divinity. A more cautious explanation could be that Mesopotamian religion was less interested in defining what a god is in abstract, universal terms, and more interested in showing what gods do. They rule cities. They receive offerings. They deliberate fate. They respond to ritual. They inhabit temples. They withdraw, appear, punish, bless, and in some stories seem just as caught up in cosmic administration as the humans serving below them. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. Here, the evidence is not thin on the point that divine councils matter. What remains thin is any claim that this proves literal, physical limitation. That would go too far. A fringe idea proposes that collective groups like the Anunnaki preserve the memory of a real governing class of powerful beings, remembered later as gods because their authority was overwhelming, but not fully transcendent. This theory isn't widely accepted, and mainstream scholarship does not require it. Still, if we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it highlights a genuine feature of the texts. Divine power often behaves administratively. The gods meet, decide, distribute, and supervise. That is not how people usually imagine beings beyond all dependence. It is how people imagine rulers inside a system. And systems create vulnerability. Not weakness exactly, but entanglement. What if the story is pointing at something else? What if the Anunnaki and their companions are imagined less as eternal abstractions and more as participants in a sacred order where every rank carries a function, and every function requires support. Councils need spaces, spaces need maintenance, authorities need recognition, judgments need ritual backing. Even the underworld, in Mesopotamian imagination, is not a vague blur. It is structured, occupied, procedural. The divine world has furniture, metaphorically speaking, and perhaps sometimes almost literally. There is also a quiet irony in imagining the highest beings holding court, while humans below grind grain, trim lamps, and pour offerings to keep the whole arrangement stable. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian religion fused celestial authority with earthly institutions because institutions were the very shape of serious life. One interpretation is that the gods look human, in part, because political order looked divine, and divine order looked political. The boundaries blur in both directions. Kings mirror gods, gods mirror kings, temples mirror palaces, palaces mirror temples. You end up with a cosmos where even holiness arrives with attendance and scheduling. That does not make the Anunnaki ordinary, far from it. Their power, mystery, and distance remain real within the tradition. But it does make them less like unconditioned philosophical absolutes and more like exalted members of a sacred administration. And once you see that, the earlier clues line up more neatly. Meals, chambers, ritual attention, labor relief, flood anxiety, and temple care all belong to a universe where the divine operates through forms of order that look startlingly familiar. So you listen now not to the hush of one room, but to the imagined murmur of a council somewhere beyond sight, where fate is discussed under a heavy sky. One documented anchor is the recurring role of the Anunnaki as a collective divine body within Mesopotamian tradition. One interpretation is that this collective identity makes them resemble a ruling assembly with duties and constraints rather than beings beyond all structure. And in the cinematic stillness of the night, what if the old stories preserved a subtle but unsettling intuition that the powers above humanity were never imagined as free from burden altogether, only high enough to hold the meeting while everyone else kept the lamps burning? That murmur of divine assembly fades, and in its place you notice something quieter, stranger, and in many ways more intimate than a council of gods deciding the fate of cities. You notice the body the god is given. Not a natural body exactly, not flesh in the ordinary sense, but a crafted one. Polished wood, precious metal, fine garments, washed hands, perfumed face, carefully opened eyes. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian cult statues were treated not merely as decorative symbols, but as living focal points of divine presence once properly consecrated. Archaeology suggests that these statues were installed, clothed, fed, anointed, and handled according to detailed ritual practice. And one interpretation is that the image gave the god a material way to dwell among humans through forms that looked startlingly bodily. What if polished stone and cedar were not just representing heaven, but lending heaven a body for the night? This is where the temple becomes almost uncanny in its tenderness. You are no longer thinking only about a distant deity somewhere above the stars, nor only about an invisible sacred force hovering in abstraction. You are thinking about a statue that must be washed, a statue that is dressed, a statue that receives meals, jewelry, fragrance, music, and ceremonial greetings. What's broadly accepted is that Mesopotamian ritual made a strong distinction between an ordinary crafted object and a cult image after consecration. The evidence we do have points to elaborate rites that transform the statue into an appropriate vessel for divine presence. It was not merely admired, it was attended. Most historians agree that rituals surrounding divine images in Mesopotamia could include acts that open the image to sacred life, though our understanding of the details varies across periods and texts. A careful reading might suggest that once the god's statue was ritually activated, the divine presence was not thought to be trapped in the object, but truly available through it. That's a possibility, not a certainty, because ancient theology rarely pauses to give us a neat philosophical manual. Still, the practical consequences are clear enough. If the image is treated as alive in ritual terms, then feeding it, clothing it, and housing it stop looking like mere symbolic gestures and begin to look like the ordinary obligations of care owed to a present being. And that brings you right back to tonight's central puzzle. If the god receives a body in image form, then the body must be maintained. Garments must be changed. Jewelry must be secured. The face must be cleaned. Fragrance must be refreshed. Food must be brought. The inner chamber must remain worthy. One interpretation is that the cult statue gave shape to divine nearness in ways human communities could actually manage. A more cautious explanation could be that the image served as the ritual point where heaven and city met, and bodily acts of care expressed respect, not biological necessity. That may be the safest ground. But even that safe ground still feels remarkable. Respect here is expressed almost entirely through the language of bodily comfort. Historians still argue whether Mesopotamian worshippers imagined the god as literally inhabiting the statue in a constant sense, temporarily visiting it through ritual, or being represented through a mode of presence more flexible than either modern category suggests. There's no full consensus. Scholars continue to debate the exact status of the image because the ancient evidence shows seriousness without always giving later readers the conceptual labels they want. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. Did the god sleep in the image? Did the image stand as an earthly court body for a being otherwise beyond containment? Or was the distinction itself less important to ancient minds than modern ones assume? The bodily care of the cult image also helps explain why temples needed so much routine. If divine presence arrives through a material locus, then matter must be managed carefully. Dust is not just dust anymore. Neglect is not just neglect. A missed washing, a damaged robe, a cold lamp, or an empty offering table all risk becoming failures of hospitality toward the sacred. Most historians agree that ritual precision mattered deeply in Mesopotamian temple service. Archaeology suggests that temple personnel, supplies, and storage systems supported this ongoing precision in very concrete ways. One interpretation is that the statue functioned almost like a ceremonial body through which divine dignity could be preserved among humans. That idea may feel especially striking because it makes divine dependence visible. Let me rephrase that more carefully. It does not necessarily mean the god was weak in itself. It means the mode of divine presence chosen in temple ritual required human participation at every step. The god's body in the sanctuary was cared for by human hands. The god's meals were prepared from human labor. The god's garments were woven by human work. The god's chamber was kept clean by human attention. That raises the possibility that Mesopotamian religion imagined not a detached sacred reality beyond all contact, but a deliberately embodied sacred presence that accepted the vulnerability of nearness. A fringe idea proposes that cult statues preserve memory of actual rulers or powerful beings once maintained through ceremonial body care, later transformed into divine images as direct presence receded into memory. This theory isn't widely accepted, but you can see its emotional logic. The rituals feel so personal, so courtly, so physical, that later imaginations naturally wonder whether they began with somebody more concrete than a purely invisible god. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, the theory simply intensifies a mainstream observation. The divine in Mesopotamia was often made present through bodies, or at least through bodily forms. What if the story is pointing at something else? What if the cult statue is the clearest clue that ancient people did not separate the spiritual from the material the way later traditions sometimes try to do? The god is not diminished by being clothed. The god is not insulted by being fed. The god is not made less sacred by inhabiting an image. Instead, sacred power becomes approachable through matter. Wood, gold, linen, oil, bread, and perfume all become part of the same language. Heaven comes near by borrowing the grammar of the body, and that body, though crafted, must still be tended through the rhythm of day and night. Most historians agree that divine images were central to temple life because they localized sacred presence in a manageable, serviceable form. One interpretation is that these images made it possible to imagine gods not only as rulers, but as presences requiring ongoing comfort and ceremonial care. In a way, this may be the most revealing thing of all. The old question about whether the gods needed to eat and rest becomes less bizarre once you realize that the gods were given a body through which eating and resting could be enacted. So, you stand once more in the inner room, but now the mystery has a face, a robe, a polished surface catching the lamp. One documented anchor is the ritual treatment of Mesopotamian cult statues as living focal points of divine presence. One interpretation is that the image allowed sacred beings to be approached through bodily care, making meals, clothing, and rest part of the logic of worship. And in the cinematic hush of oil light on gold, what if the strangest thing the ancient temple ever did was not simply adore the gods, but patiently lend them a body delicate enough to require human hands before the night was done? The lamp glints on the statue's face, and for a moment, the whole temple seems balanced between something entirely ordinary and something almost impossible. A robe hangs from carved shoulders. Oil softens the dry air. Bread sits where it has been placed. Outside, the city settles into its nighttime sounds: dogs, sandals, distant voices, the hush of reed beds beyond the walls. And now, because the image of divine bodily care has grown so vivid, the older and wilder interpretations come naturally creeping back in. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian religion influenced later mythic traditions across the ancient Near East in complicated ways, though not always directly or neatly. Archaeology suggests that many ideas changed as they traveled, and one interpretation is that memories of gods who required service may have contributed to later stories about divine beings who were powerful yet limited. What if some of the oldest unease in these myths comes from imagining holiness itself made strangely small? This is the part where modern people often reach for the loudest theory first. A fringe idea proposes that the Anunnaki and related divine figures were never truly gods in a transcendent sense at all, but fallen, diminished, or earthbound beings whose needs were later dressed in the language of divinity. This theory isn't widely accepted. We should say that clearly, gently, and without dramatic thunder in the background. The evidence we do have does not require that conclusion. Most historians would not read the text that way. Still, if we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, the idea helps illuminate why Mesopotamian religion continues to fascinate people who feel uneasy with perfectly abstract divinity. The old stories keep giving you bodies, meals, chambers, councils, labor, regret, and routine. They keep making sacred power look near enough to need management. A careful reading might suggest that later imaginations are responding less to hard evidence than to a genuine emotional tone in the sources. Mesopotamian gods often feel elevated, yes, but not infinitely remote. They can be offended, soothed, burdened, honored, clothed and appealed to. Their statues can be carried away in war. Their temples can fall silent. Their favor can seem unstable. A more cautious explanation could be that this is simply how ancient polytheistic religion works when it is tightly bound to cities and institutions. Gods are local, relational, and embedded in history. They are not yet being defined by later philosophical language about absolute perfection or total self-sufficiency. That may be the safest ground of all, and it is solid enough to stand on barefoot, even if the mud is cold. Still, historians still argue whether the bodily and political realism of Mesopotamian religion should be understood mainly as an early stage in theological development, as a stable religious form in its own right, or as evidence that ancient people imagined divinity through categories fundamentally different from later monotheistic traditions. There's no full consensus, because the question itself partly depends on what you mean by a god. Scholars continue to debate how much continuity there is between early Mesopotamian divine imagery and later religious ideas that became more abstract, moralized, or universalized. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. Were these gods less divine by later standards, or simply divine in a very different register? That difference is where the phrase fallen beings sometimes sneaks in, though it should be handled with care. A popular rumor claims that ancient myths across cultures preserve distorted memories of once powerful entities reduced to dependence, hunger, conflict, and decline. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it appeals because it turns human-like gods into a kind of clue. If the divine world looks too much like a tired court, perhaps, the theory says, that is because the beings in question were never meant to be worshipped as ultimate in the first place. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, the rumor becomes less a claim about aliens, demons, or lost rulers, and more a reflection of a simple discomfort. People often expect gods to be above need, and Mesopotamian religion does not always grant that expectation. Let me rephrase that more carefully. The most responsible conclusion is not that the Anunnaki were secretly fallen super beings in disguise. The most responsible conclusion is that Mesopotamian texts preserve a model of sacred power that is relational, embodied, and bounded by role. Gods can be overwhelming without being absolute. They can be cosmic without being beyond every practical concern. they can rule while still receiving support. One interpretation is that later readers, accustomed to cleaner definitions of divinity, experience this older model as almost scandalously intimate. That is suggestive, not conclusive, but it helps explain the enduring sense that something in these stories does not behave like godhood as many modern people imagine it. And there is another possibility worth following more gently. What if the old stories are not hinting that the gods were not divine enough, but that human beings in ancient Mesopotamia understood the world itself as more entangled than we do? Power is not pure independence. Authority is not freedom from relationship. Kings need servants. Cities need canals. Temples need bread. Gods need ritual. In such a world, dependence is not embarrassment. It is structure. A more cautious explanation could be that divine need in Mesopotamian religion does not signal weakness so much as participation in the fabric of ordered life. If that is true, then later fringe theories may be reading ancient intimacy as decline when it was never decline at all. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian religion was not primarily obsessed with hidden origins or secret cosmic imposters. It was concerned with stability, reciprocity, kingship, fertility, fate, and survival under difficult conditions. Archaeology suggests that real cities, real fields, and real institutions shaped these beliefs at every level. One interpretation is that when the gods appear embodied and limited, they do so because ancient people lived in a world where everything sacred had to touch matter somewhere. Offerings touched matter. Statues touched matter. Writing touched matter. Law touched matter. Even prayer rose in smoke, scent, and voice. What if the story is pointing at something else? What if the real lesson is not that the gods fell into the human realm, but that the human realm was never imagined as separate enough from the divine for such a fall to be necessary? A fringe idea proposes that the transition from bodily, service-receiving gods to more transcendent ideas in later traditions reflects a long cultural forgetting, a smoothing over of older memories, too earthy to survive intact. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it does capture a real contrast. The Mesopotamian sacred world is earthy. It smells like oil, grain, linen, cedar, and river mud. It does not float above the senses. And because it does not float, it remains vulnerable to all the questions floating worlds can avoid. Where do the gods dwell? How are they served? Why do they need offerings? What happens if their houses fail? So you stand there in the layered darkness with the cult image before you and the city behind you, feeling both the pull of wild speculation and the weight of simpler truths. One documented anchor is the strongly embodied relational character of Mesopotamian divine life as reflected in ritual, myth, and temple care. One interpretation is that later fringe theories about diminished or limited beings grow out of that embodied character, even if the evidence does not require those theories. And in the cinematic quiet of the sanctuary, what if the old unease remains because these stories refuse to give you a God who is either fully human or fully beyond humanity, offering instead a sacred presence that is grand enough to rule, but near enough to need a room, a robe, and the steady comfort of being served before dawn? Before dawn, the temple feels at its most revealing. The night attendants are tired in the ordinary human way, the lamps have burned low, and the city beyond the walls lies in that brief, fragile pause before labor begins again. It is in this soft interval that the whole pattern you have been following starts to come together. Meals, chambers, councils, statues, offerings, repairs, royal duty, flood anxiety, all of it circles a single, quiet thought. In Mesopotamian religion, power does not float above the world untouched. It is imagined inside systems of order, and systems of order require upkeep. Most historians agree that rest, feasting, and regular provision were not only private comforts in the ancient Near East, but also markers of rank, legitimacy, and social stability. Archaeology suggests that elites, temples, and households alike expressed status through managed abundance and controlled rhythms of labor and pause. And one interpretation is that divine fatigue in Mesopotamian myth mirrors a broader cultural truth. Authority itself was imagined as something that had to be supported if it was to remain effective. What if the real revelation is not that the gods were weak, but that ancient people understood power as something that could grow tired? That idea may sound almost too simple after all the mystery, but simple ideas are often the ones buried deepest. What's broadly accepted is that ancient Mesopotamian civilization depended on intense organization. Water had to be managed, fields had to be coordinated, labor had to be directed, temples had to be provisioned. Kings had to perform competence visibly and repeatedly. This was not a world where you could build a city, walk away, and assume the universe would handle the rest. The evidence we do have points to a culture in which order was always being made and remade through human effort. A more cautious explanation could be that the gods in myth reflect this same logic, because myth tends to magnify the structure of ordinary life. If every level of society needs maintenance, perhaps the divine world is imagined the same way. And once you see that, rest stops looking trivial. Rest is not laziness in this world. Rest is the sign that order is holding. A ruler at feast is not merely indulging himself. He is displaying stability, wealth, and successful control over resources. A well-fed household signals functioning provision. A temple with full offering tables signals a healthy bond between city and deity. One interpretation is that divine meals and divine rest are best understood not as embarrassing biological confessions, but as symbols of settled authority. The god rests because the god's house is in order. The god is fed because the city has fulfilled its obligations. The ritual does not expose weakness so much as confirm that the chain of support is still intact. Yet the older tension remains, and it should. Historians still argue whether Mesopotamian depictions of divine fatigue and satisfaction are primarily social metaphors, or whether they reflect a more immediate theological sense that the gods really did participate in rhythms of depletion and renewal. There's no full consensus. Scholars continue to debate how far these portrayals should be taken beyond literary convention and ritual form. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. We'll keep the solid ground separate from the mist. Still, even the safest reading allows something striking. Mesopotamian religion does not seem especially interested in protecting divine beings from the appearance of need. It gives them needs and then builds civilization around meeting them. That is where the comparison with kings becomes especially useful. Most historians agree that royal ideology in Mesopotamia linked the ruler's legitimacy to his ability to maintain order, provide abundance, and preserve sacred institutions. A careful reading might suggest that the gods and kings mirror one another not only in power, but in dependence. Kings rule, but they rely on officials, laborers, food systems, and ceremony. Gods rule, but they too receive service, housing, offerings, and praise. That's a possibility, not a certainty, though the parallels are difficult to ignore. In both cases, authority looks less like isolated self-sufficiency and more like the top point of a living pyramid that can only stand if every lower layer holds. There is also a more human truth inside this. If you live in a world where exhaustion is normal, where every harvest depends on effort, where canals clog, storms arrive, and buildings decay, then perhaps imagining perfectly untiring power would feel less believable than imagining glorious power that still requires rhythms of replenishment. What if the story is pointing at something else? What if ancient people trusted gods more, not less, when those gods resembled the logic of life they already knew? A god who receives food, withdraws to rest, and responds to care may feel more present than a god beyond all relation. Presence, in Mesopotamia, may matter more than philosophical perfection. A fringe idea proposes that the recurring image of service-dependent gods preserves the memory of a real ruling class, whose power was immense but physically bounded, and that later generations gradually transformed this memory into religion. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it persists because the old texts are unusually comfortable joining majesty with maintenance. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, the theory becomes less a claim to solve the mystery and more a symptom of it. People sense that Mesopotamian gods do not behave like untouched absolutes, and they go hunting for an explanation dramatic enough to match the feeling. Sometimes the simpler explanation is already enough. The gods reflect a civilization where the highest realities were imagined through hierarchy, labor, and care. And let me rephrase that more carefully. The most responsible conclusion is not that the Anunnaki were merely needy rulers pretending to be divine. The most responsible conclusion is that Mesopotamian religion framed sacred authority through the same patterns that organize city life: provision, obligation, ceremony, household, and pause. Rest matters because labor exists. Feasting matters because scarcity exists. Order matters because collapse is always nearby. One interpretation is that divine need within this worldview says less about weakness than about participation in the precarious beauty of a maintained world. And that precarious beauty is everywhere as dawn approaches. Someone sweeps a threshold. Someone checks a vessel. Someone rekindles a lamp that never should have gone out. Outside, the first workers stir, the first animals shift, the first sounds of waking life begin to ripple along the streets. The temple will return to its daily rhythm soon enough. Offerings will be prepared, words will be spoken, garments adjusted, records kept. The sacred household will wake with the city, because in a sense, it never slept entirely. It only rested under watch. One documented anchor is the central role of provision, rhythm, and supported authority in Mesopotamian civilization. One interpretation is that divine fatigue and rest in myth reflect a broader ancient understanding that power remains effective only when properly sustained. And in the cinematic hush just before sunrise touches the top of the ziggurat, what if the oldest secret hidden in these tablets is gentler than it first appears? Not that the gods were exposed as frauds by their hunger and sleep, but that ancient people imagined even heaven through the tender, practical truth that everything worthy of endurance must somehow be cared for. And now the sky begins to pale, not with the hard brightness of full day yet, but with that soft gray-blue easing that makes mud brick walls look gentler than they did at midnight. The ziggurat stands in silhouette. The river moves with its old patient sound. A few birds begin the first hesitant notes of mourning, as if even they are not quite certain whether the world is ready to wake. You have followed the clues as far as they can reasonably be followed tonight. You have walked through temple kitchens and inner chambers, through divine labor and human creation, through flood fear, royal duty, ritual feeding, cult statues, and the guarded privacy of sanctuaries. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian religion grew out of real cities, real institutions, real agriculture, and real vulnerability. Archaeology suggests that the gods of this world were imagined through the structures that shaped human life most deeply, and one interpretation is that divine eating and resting were not stray oddities, but part of a much larger vision of sacred power as embodied, relational, and maintained. What if the mystery turns out to be gentler than the title first promised, and more profound for that very reason? The broad ground beneath your feet is firm enough now. What's broadly accepted is that ancient Mesopotamian temples functioned as houses of the gods, that offerings of food and drink were central to ritual life, that cult statues were treated as living focal points of divine presence, and that myths such as Atrahasis portray divine beings in ways that involve labor, fatigue, irritation, and dependence on human service. The evidence we do have points to a religious imagination that did not feel the need to hide sacred beings behind perfect abstraction. Gods could be majestic and still receive meals. They could rule and still require housing. They could shape fate and still withdraw to a chamber at the day's end. A careful reading might suggest that this is not a contradiction in Mesopotamian thought. It is simply what divinity looked like in a world organized by household, hierarchy, and care. Historians still argue whether these features should be read as symbolic ritual language, as genuine theological realism within the ancient frame, or as some blend of both that modern categories do not quite capture. There's no full consensus, and that is part of why the old texts remain so alive. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. Did ancient worshippers think the gods literally consumed the essence of offerings in a way they would have described as real? Quite possibly, within ritual logic. Did they imagine divine rest as biological sleep in exactly the way a human collapses after a long day? The evidence is thinner there, so we should be careful. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. But even with that care, the pattern remains strong. The sacred in Mesopotamia is not imagined as aloof from the practical world. It is imagined inside it. That may be the most important conclusion of all. One interpretation is that the Anunnaki and related powers feel unusual to modern audiences because many of us inherit later assumptions about what a god ought to be: absolute, unconditioned, infinitely self-sustaining, untouched by any hint of appetite, environment, or rhythm. Mesopotamian religion does not always share those assumptions. A more cautious explanation could be that it simply belongs to a different theological atmosphere, one where presence matters more than perfection, and order matters more than abstraction. The god is near. The god has a house. The god is served. The god must be pleased. The city's life is tied to that reality, not as a side note, but as the beating center of civilization. A fringe idea proposes that all this points to powerful but limited beings, later mistaken for full divinity, remembered dimly as the Anunnaki of modern speculation. This theory isn't widely accepted, and nothing in the mainstream evidence requires it. Let me rephrase that more carefully. The oldest texts are already fascinating without turning them into a secret file on extraterrestrial management problems. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, such speculation can still be useful in one small way. It reminds you that the Mesopotamian evidence really does preserve a sacred world that feels more physical, administrative, and vulnerable than many later religious imaginations. That feeling is real, even if the bolder explanations remain unproven. And perhaps that is why these clay tablets continue to whisper so effectively across the centuries. They do not hand you one hidden truth wrapped in certainty. They offer something subtler. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. We have kept the solid ground separate from the mist. On the solid ground, ancient Mesopotamian religion linked gods, cities, temples, kings, food, labor, and ritual into a single fabric of maintained order. In the mist, if you let yourself drift just a little, you can almost imagine the oldest sanctuaries as places where divine greatness was measured, not only in thunder and decree, but in the quiet fact that even heaven accepted a meal from human hands. What if the story is pointing at something else? What if these texts are not really trying to tell you that the gods were weak, hungry, or less divine than they claimed? What if they are showing you that the ancient world could not imagine a meaningful power without relationship? Power receives service because power belongs in a household. Power rests because power has carried responsibility. Power is honored because power can also withdraw. In that kind of universe, dependence is not humiliation. It is the price of nearness. A God who can be fed is a God who can be hosted. A God who can rest is a God who can dwell among the living. That may be stranger than the usual modern fantasy of the Anunnaki, and also, in its own quiet way, far more beautiful. So as the first fuller light brushes the upper bricks of the temple, the question softens. Did the Anunnaki have to eat and rest because they were not divine beings? Most historians would not put it that way. What's broadly accepted is that Mesopotamian divine beings were fully gods within their own tradition, even while being portrayed with very human-like needs and routines. One interpretation is that those routines reveal a sacred world imagined through the daily logic of labor, hospitality, and provision. And in the cinematic stillness of dawn, what if the real answer is this? The old stories do not diminish the gods by giving them meals and chambers. They make them present enough to matter. Now the pace can slow. The lamps are nearly done, and the first daylight is gentle on the walls. You do not have to solve the last mystery. You only have to sit beside it for a little while longer. Let the tablets remain clay in your hands, cool and slightly rough, their signs pressed by someone long gone, who also lived in a world of dawns and duties and the soft relief of rest after labor. Let the temple remain quiet behind its doorway. Let the God remain in the inner room, neither fully explained nor fully hidden, served by bread and beer and song, attended by careful hands, belonging to a universe where care is one of the oldest sacred acts. The river keeps moving. The reeds stir. Somewhere a baker is already awake, and somewhere else a priest is preparing the first small duties of morning with the same patience as the priest before him and the priest before that, back through the stacked centuries. Nothing needs to be rushed now. The great questions can loosen their grip. The Anunnaki can fade back into shadow, not as a solved puzzle, but as a set of old names carried by old stories from a land that knew how fragile order could be. And perhaps that is enough for tonight, to leave them there in the half-light, not as aliens or imposters or broken divinities, but as sacred figures imagined by a people who understood that even the highest powers must be welcomed, tended, and given their place. So the city wakes slowly, and you drift away from it slowly too. The brick steps cool beneath the fading night. The scent of barley lingers. The fan hum in your room blends with the imagined wind over the plain. Your shoulders loosen. Your thoughts grow softer around the edges. The temple, the statues, the offerings, the chambers, the floodwater, the council halls, the warm bread set down before a waiting God, they all recede together into one long, quiet thread of memory. You do not need to hold every detail. You can let them settle. And as they settle, let the final image be a calm one, a sanctuary before sunrise, a low lamp, a bowl on a table, a curtain hardly moving. Beyond it, a sleeping city. Above it, a brightening sky. Nothing proven, nothing forced, only clues and care, and the old human instinct to imagine that what is highest in the world might still welcome a little peace, a little order, a little rest.